Lana Rivers had always imagined that buying a home in an exclusive gated community would finally allow her to live the quiet, structured life she had longed for, far from the chaos of her past years spent moving from one noisy city apartment to another, and at first glance the neighborhood looked like something taken from an architectural magazine. The rows of modern houses aligned with almost mathematical precision, the manicured lawns trimmed to the exact same height, the cul-de-sacs echoing with silence broken only by the occasional sound of sprinklers clicking in rhythm, and the ornamental street lamps casting their sterile glow across sidewalks that seemed designed to look perfect rather than to be walked upon. The Homeowners Association, known among residents simply as the HOA, promised order, safety, and beauty, and although Lana was aware that such organizations often came with unnecessary rules and an overbearing sense of control, she convinced herself that the benefits outweighed the nuisance, especially since she was not a particularly social neighbor and intended to keep her interactions minimal, staying focused on her work as an architect and on finally building the kind of private sanctuary she felt she deserved. When her older brother Mark arrived for a weekend visit, the community appeared to him much the same as it had to Lana during her first tour of the property, too polished, too rehearsed, as though the place existed less for living than for proving some ideal of suburban perfection. Mark, who had spent years in the military and then quietly transitioned into a position few outside political circles knew about, serving as part of the governor's personal security detail, did not remark openly on the neighborhood's artificial charm, yet Lana noticed how his eyes lingered on the uniformity of the houses, how he slowed slightly when walking past the identical mailboxes and the surveillance cameras perched on corners, how his gaze carried the weight of someone accustomed to reading environments for threats rather than aesthetics. For Lana, his presence was a source of comfort. She was used to being alone, used to managing her battles against bureaucracy and clients on her own, but Mark had always had a way of making her feel that no matter what chaos pressed against the edges of her life, someone steady was watching her back. He was not the sort of man who drew attention to himself. He dressed plainly, preferred to stay in the background, and rarely volunteered stories about his current work, leaving even Lana with only fragments of what he really did from day to day. That weekend, he helped her carry boxes of architectural models from her garage, walked with her through the narrow trails that separated her neighborhood from the wider city, and sat on her porch in the evening as the sun settled behind the carefully planted rows of trees the HOA insisted on calling a forest reserve. Yet his subtle habits stood out. The way he scanned each car that passed, the fact that he never sat with his back to the street, the way he carried a small notepad and occasionally jotted quick sketches or notes after their walks. None of this was unusual for Lana. She had grown up with Mark's quiet discipline, his meticulous attention to detail, but for neighbors unaccustomed to such behavior, it was easy to see how it could be misinterpreted. It did not take long for suspicion to find a voice. On the second evening of Mark's visit, while Lana and her brother were unloading groceries, their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Hudson, a widow with a reputation for inserting herself into every corner of community life, paused at the edge of her driveway and watched Mark with narrowed eyes. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to believe she understood every detail about everyone who belonged there, and the sight of a man she had not seen before, moving with quiet precision and carrying himself with a soldier's stillness, unsettled her. Later that night, as Mark sat in his parked car by the entrance gate making notes from memory about the strange layout of the community, she observed him again from her second-floor window. To her, it looked as though he were conducting surveillance, mapping out the streets for some hidden purpose, and she wasted no time calling another neighbor to whisper about the mysterious man Lana had brought into their perfect enclave. Lana, unaware of how quickly rumors spread in such closed environments, felt only relief that her brother had finally taken a break from his grueling schedule to spend time with her. She appreciated his calm presence, the way he carried conversations without judgment, and the rare comfort of family in a place that often felt sterile despite its expensive polish. What she could not have anticipated was how quickly the HOA, driven by its hunger for control and its readiness to see danger in anything that did not conform to its narrow standards, would turn that weekend visit into the beginning of a nightmare. One that would spiral far beyond petty disputes about lawn height or paint color and reveal a darker truth about the lengths to which some would go when they believed their authority unchallenged. The following morning began without any hint of trouble, with sunlight filtering through the immaculate blinds Lana had chosen for their subtle geometry, the kind of detail only an architect would obsess over, and for a while the weekend seemed calm, almost ordinary, with Mark offering to cook breakfast in his usual understated way while Lana reviewed some sketches on her laptop. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of their day, small currents of tension were already building, currents she did not recognize until they broke across her doorstep in a form that at first seemed almost laughable. Around noon, while Lana sorted through her mail, she noticed an envelope slipped under the door, not the kind of envelope that came from the postal service with a stamp and an address, but a heavy cream-colored fold with embossed letters that read, simply, Neighborhood Safety Division, Community Compliance Department. The language struck her as oddly official and yet artificial, as though it belonged to some imitation of government rather than the real thing. Inside, on stiff paper with bold black lettering, was a notice. Unregistered individual observed residing at your property. Immediate verification required. Failure to comply may result in community safety measures. At the bottom was a line for resident acknowledgement, though no signature had yet been placed, as though they already expected her to sign away her compliance without question. Lana frowned, handed the paper to Mark, and asked if he thought this was some kind of prank. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening in a way she recognized from years past. Not with fear, but with irritation. The irritation of a man who had seen too many hollow imitations of authority used to intimidate those who didn't know better. By late afternoon, the matter escalated. A white SUV rolled quietly up the street, stopping in front of Lana's driveway, its sides unmarked except for decals that mimicked law enforcement insignia, but upon closer inspection revealed themselves to be vague symbols with no actual jurisdiction. Behind them, a stylized eagle with oddly geometric wings, and below it the words Neighborhood Safety Patrol. 3 men stepped out, each dressed in freshly pressed uniforms that looked official only from a distance but up close betrayed the cheap stitching of costume suppliers. They carried radios, clipboards, and wore dark glasses, though the day was overcast. And as they approached, their movements carried a rehearsed stiffness that reminded Mark more of poorly trained security guards than professionals. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a booming voice, introduced himself as Officer Grant of the HOA Patrol, holding out a laminated badge that bore neither a state seal nor any recognizable police department insignia. Lana felt her stomach tighten as they began their performance. They claimed they had received reports of an unidentified male living on her property without registering with the association, and according to their regulations, such individuals posed a potential threat to neighborhood safety. Mark, standing quietly at her side, allowed them to finish their speech before replying with measured calm, telling them that he was her brother, visiting for the weekend, and that there was no law requiring him to register his presence with a private association. His tone was polite but firm, not confrontational, yet his refusal to hand over identification infuriated them, as though they had expected him to fold immediately under the weight of their fake authority. The shaved-headed leader stepped closer, his shadow falling across Lana's porch, and insisted that failure to comply would be treated as trespassing. Lana tried to interject, explaining that as the homeowner she had invited her brother, and that was the end of the matter. But the men ignored her, their attention locked on Mark. It became clear to her in that moment that their performance was not about rules, but about domination, about forcing a response to validate their authority, and her brother's quiet refusal to play along had unsettled them. One of the others, a younger man whose uniform looked a size too large, muttered something about uncooperative subjects, and before Lana could fully register what was happening, They moved in. Mark did not resist physically, though he could have. Instead, he remained composed, his eyes fixed on Lana with a steady calm that said more than words. Do not panic. Watch what happens. They placed plastic cuffs around his wrists, speaking in exaggerated tones about detainment for verification, and led him toward the SUV as if staging a performance for an invisible audience. Lana's protests grew sharper, her voice rising as she demanded to know under what authority they were taking him. She shouted that she would call the police, to which the leader replied smoothly, "We are the police here, ma'am. Community police. Your cooperation will make this easier." The SUV door slammed, the sound echoing like a verdict, and the vehicle rolled down the street with her brother inside, leaving Lana standing on her porch with the notice still in her hand, her pulse hammering, and her thoughts colliding in confusion and anger. She did call the police then, dialing the real emergency number with trembling hands, and after a brief explanation she received a response that chilled her more than the fake officer's bravado. The dispatcher listened politely, asked whether the men had claimed to be from a government agency, and when Lana explained that they were HOA security officers, the dispatcher sighed and told her that disputes with homeowners associations were considered civil matters, not criminal unless physical harm had occurred. Lana tried to explain that they had arrested someone, taken him against his will, but the voice on the line grew bureaucratic, repeating that unless she could confirm they had impersonated actual law enforcement or caused injury, the department would not intervene. As she hung up, Lana felt a hollowness she had never known before in her own home, a dawning realization that the very structure designed to offer safety and order had twisted itself into something else entirely, something more insidious. Her brother had been removed not by criminals in ski masks, not by official police, but by men wearing counterfeit symbols of power sanctioned by the very association she had thought would protect her investment. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their faces a blend of curiosity and fear, but none stepped forward, none intervened. Whether out of loyalty to the HOA or fear of reprisal, they watched silently as though the spectacle were an inevitable part of living here. Lana, left standing in the quiet street, felt a wave of cold clarity wash over her. This was no misunderstanding or overzealous security measure. This was a deliberate display of control, and Mark, calm even in restraint, had been taken because he represented resistance. What she did not yet know was that his silence and apparent compliance were not signs of defeat, but of calculation. For Mark was not a man to be intimidated by cheap uniforms and counterfeit authority. He was waiting, watching, and preparing to reveal the truth of who he was and what power he carried, a truth that would soon turn the HOA's theater of control into the beginning of its unraveling. Lana did not sleep that night, her mind pacing as relentlessly as her feet had across the hardwood floors of her living room, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of her brother being led away by men who had no right to touch him, men who had wrapped themselves in the costume of authority and dared to stage an abduction in broad daylight under the pretense of neighborhood security. She had spent the first hours after his disappearance making calls, not only to the local police department but also to the county sheriff's office and even to a legal hotline she had once bookmarked for property disputes, and each answer left her more entangled in frustration. The police insisted it was a civil matter unless a crime could be clearly proven. The sheriff's office redirected her back to municipal authorities, and the legal hotline suggested she gather all correspondence from the HOA and prepare for mediation, as if the abduction of her brother could be smoothed away with paperwork and a calendar appointment. By the time the sky lightened into dawn, her exhaustion had hardened into resolve, and she decided that if no one else would tell her where her brother had been taken, she would find out herself. She drove to the small office complex that housed the HOA headquarters, a bland stucco building wedged between a dry cleaner and a dental practice, its glass door already displaying the words Community Compliance Office. Hours 9 to 5. When she stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of toner and disinfectant, and the receptionist, a woman with an expression polished into indifference, greeted her with a curt nod and asked whether she had an appointment. Lana's voice was sharper than she intended when she demanded to see the president of the association, Eric Dalton, insisting that her brother had been taken by men acting under HOA authority and that she would not leave until she had an explanation. The receptionist looked momentarily unsettled, then vanished into a hallway, returning minutes later to usher Lana into a small conference room where Dalton sat at the head of a polished table, a clipboard before him and a smirk on his face that conveyed more condescension than welcome. Dalton was the kind of man who thrived on rules written not to protect but to trap, a man who interpreted bylaws like scripture and wielded them as weapons, and his demeanor suggested that he relished every opportunity to remind residents that their homes might be private property, but their lives within the neighborhood were subject to the association's gaze. He listened to Lana's account of the previous day with a polite stillness, occasionally jotting notes as though she were giving testimony at a hearing, and when she finished, his response was delivered in a tone both patient and chilling. He explained that the HOA had formed its own safety division after increasing concerns about unverified individuals in the community, that her brother had been observed acting in ways that aroused suspicion, and that the patrol officers had therefore followed procedure by detaining him for verification. Lana nearly laughed at the absurdity, except her laughter caught in her throat because Dalton's calmness left little room for disbelief. He spoke as though this entire masquerade were perfectly legitimate, as though it were her ignorance, not his, audacity that distorted the truth. She demanded to know where her brother was, her voice rising until it echoed against the conference room's sterile walls, but Dalton refused to answer directly, instead repeating that her brother would be released once the safety division completed its checks, adding with pointed emphasis that cooperative residents always experience smoother resolutions. The implication was unmistakable. If she challenged them, they would prolong his detainment. If she complied, they might release him sooner. Lana's hands tightened into fists against the table as she tried to restrain her anger, realizing that every word he spoke was designed to reduce her to silence, to convince her that her only recourse was obedience. When she left the office, her fury burned hotter than her fear. She drove aimlessly through the streets of the neighborhood, noticing details she had previously overlooked. The discreet cameras mounted not only on street corners but also on lamp posts, the identical warning signs about registered residents only, the way certain homes displayed small decals in their windows that resembled passes, as if confirming that their occupants had been cleared by some hidden registry. It dawned on her that the HOA had not simply created arbitrary rules, but had built an entire shadow system of surveillance and control, one that the real authorities ignored because it cloaked itself in the language of property rights and private governance. Meanwhile, in the bowels of the HOA clubhouse, Mark sat in a room that had been converted into a parody of an interrogation chamber, complete with a table, a single chair, and a camera perched in the corner with a blinking red light. His hands were no longer cuffed, as if his captors believed the illusion of legality was better maintained without visible restraints, but two men hovered outside the door, their voices muffled through the wall as they discussed shifts and instructions. Mark had endured real interrogations in foreign lands, had witnessed the precision of professional intelligence work, and what struck him most about this spectacle was its amateurism. The uniforms that carried no wear, the clipboards filled with generic forms that asked for irrelevant details, the way one man casually signed another's name on a protocol as though such substitution carried no consequence. He understood immediately that their power lay not in competence but in audacity, in the willingness to act like police until someone with greater authority stopped them, and he knew with absolute certainty that no such authority was coming. When one of the men finally entered to question him, The exchange was a performance of incompetence. They asked why he was in the neighborhood, whether he had ties to criminal groups, whether he intended to purchase property under false pretenses, and each question revealed more about their ignorance than his supposed guilt. Mark answered calmly, never revealing his true position, instead observing the inconsistencies in their paperwork and the nervous glances they exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. He noted the cheap ink of the stamp on their forms, the absence of any date field on their detainment order, and the fact that their radios emitted static bursts but never received actual transmissions, suggesting that their network was nothing more than an echo chamber. He remained composed because he knew panic would grant them legitimacy, but in his silence he was already gathering weapons, not physical ones but the small, irrefutable details that would one day dismantle their facade. Back in her house, Lana spread the documents she had collected across her dining table. The bogus notice, the HOA handbook, and old correspondence she had previously ignored, now combing through them with the precision of someone searching for hidden clauses in a contract designed to deceive. What struck her most was how language had been weaponized. Phrases like community compliance and mandatory cooperation, repeated endlessly, cloaking coercion in civility. She realized that this was not merely a neighborhood quirk or a case of overzealous volunteers, but the architecture of a regime, built on the assumption that residents would be too fearful, too disorganized, or too exhausted to resist. And with her brother held somewhere within its walls, she knew she had no choice but to resist, even if she had to stand alone against the entire machine. Mark had always believed that silence could be a sharper blade than any weapon, and in the hours that followed his staged detention he wielded it with deliberate precision, saying little, letting the so-called officers fill the space with their rehearsed questions and contrived threats because he knew that the more they spoke, the more they would betray themselves. What struck him most was how fragile their performance was, how every detail seemed carefully arranged for appearances yet fell apart under close observation. The plastic badges that reflected too brightly under the fluorescent lights, the folders of incident reports filled with copy-pasted paragraphs where only names had been swapped, the way one of the men avoided eye contact whenever he read from his script as though ashamed of the lie he was living. Mark watched, memorized, and filed away each inconsistency, not because he needed it to escape. He had already gauged the weakness of their vigilance and knew he could walk out if he wished, but because he understood that the true victory lay not in breaking free but in exposing the structure itself, in revealing the HOA's theater of power for what it was. Meanwhile, Lana's desperation had carried her beyond the borders of patience and into the realm of strategy. She had realized, after her confrontation with Dalton, that direct appeals would achieve nothing, that the HOA thrived precisely because it cloaked coercion in paperwork and dared outsiders to challenge its legitimacy, confident that most would surrender rather than wage a draining legal war. So she turned to subtler methods. She began speaking with neighbors, not in grand declarations but in quiet conversations held on porches and at mailboxes. And she discovered that beneath the polished lawns and rehearsed smiles there was a current of unease. One elderly man admitted that his daughter had been questioned by the safety patrol for visiting too often. A single mother whispered that her teenage son had been followed on his way home from school and accused of trespassing. And another resident, a widower who had lived there since the neighborhood was first built, confessed that he no longer felt comfortable inviting friends over because the HOA demanded he register every guest in advance. These stories painted a portrait more disturbing than Lana had imagined. The HOA had not only created its own false authority, but had weaponized it to cultivate fear, punishing anyone who stepped outside its invented boundaries. Armed with this knowledge, she returned to her dining table, where documents now spread like the blueprints she once studied as a young architect. Yet these blueprints were not of buildings but of a bureaucracy built to entrap. She saw how the HOA's handbook had been quietly revised over the years, each edition more restrictive than the last, slipping new clauses into the text under the guise of community improvement. A clause about visitor verification had been transformed into mandatory identity registration for all non-residents, while a section once devoted to noise ordinances now carried language about community safety interventions. To a casual reader, the changes might appear insignificant, but Lana recognized the technique: gradual accretion, where small adjustments accumulate until the whole structure has shifted into something unrecognizable. While she traced these threads, Mark was conducting his own investigation from within. The men guarding him were careless with their words, and though they spoke in lowered tones, years of training had sharpened his ability to catch fragments and weave them into patterns. He learned that the patrol was not a long-standing division but a recent invention, cobbled together by Dalton and a handful of loyalists who saw opportunity in fear. They recruited disaffected men from low-wage security jobs, promising authority and a sense of power they had never held before, dressing them in uniforms that imitated law enforcement but cost little more than theatrical props. He also learned that Dalton had begun framing the patrol not merely as a convenience but as a necessity, telling residents that crime outside the gates was rising, that only the HOA's vigilance stood between them and chaos. The irony was not lost on Mark. In creating the illusion of danger, Dalton had manufactured justification for his own private militia, a circle of power feeding on its own shadow. The turning point came when Mark managed, with deliberate calm, to encourage one of the younger guards into overconfidence. During a break, when the guard entered with a cup of coffee and tried to engage him in small talk, Mark responded with casual interest, feigning curiosity about the patrol's work. The young man, eager to impress, began boasting about how they had caught other unregistered visitors, how they had detained a contractor overnight simply for lacking a permit, how Dalton personally reviewed every case before deciding whether to impose fines or issue warnings. The more he spoke, the more he revealed, until he let slip something crucial, a reference to a storage room beneath the clubhouse where files and recordings were kept, evidence of every detainment, every fine, every fabricated violation. Mark's expression never shifted, but inside he recognized that this was the key, the proof that could dismantle the entire apparatus if only it reached the right hands. Lana, on her side of the struggle, realized that direct confrontation with Dalton risked escalating matters further, so she devised a different approach. She attended a scheduled community presentation, advertised innocently as a meeting about neighborhood safety, and found herself in a room filled with charts, pamphlets, and Dalton himself delivering a speech with the practiced cadence of a man who enjoyed hearing his own authority amplified. As he displayed slides about compliance rates and risk reduction, Lana noticed familiar images, diagrams nearly identical to the ones in her brother's notebook, layouts of the neighborhood streets, annotated with zones marked in red and green. To the untrained eye, they appeared as harmless maps of patrol coverage, but to Lana, trained in architectural mapping, they revealed patterns of control, funneling movement through choke points, maximizing surveillance, restricting flow. It was not about safety at all. It was about domination through design. The revelation struck her with sudden clarity. Dalton was not improvising, but constructing a system, a living architecture of power in which every pathway, every regulation, every invented fine contributed to a larger design meant to control. Behavior. Her architectural instincts told her what others might miss. This was a structure as deliberate as any building, and like any structure it could be dismantled if one identified the load-bearing walls. She realized that the storage room Mark had learned of, the one filled with files and recordings, was such a wall. Expose it, and the facade would crumble. That night, unable to sleep again, she walked the silent streets and noticed how every detail now seemed ominous. The uniform hedges hiding small cameras, the ornamental lamps glowing like watchtowers, the subtle hum of generators that powered more than just streetlights. She felt the neighborhood itself was conspiring against her. Yet she also felt a surge of defiance, because if architecture could be designed to enslave, it could also be repurposed to liberate, and she intended to turn Dalton's system against him. By the time the first light of morning broke, Lana and Mark were moving toward an unspoken alignment, she from the outside and he from within, both uncovering threads of the same fabric. What neither knew yet was how close they were to collision, how the discovery of those files, those recordings, those carefully hidden documents would mark the moment the HOA's illusion began to tear apart, not through violent rebellion, but through the simple, undeniable weight of truth. The midpoint of their ordeal was not escape or confrontation, but recognition. The recognition that they were no longer dealing with petty officials or nosy neighbors, but with an organized structure of power masquerading as community, and that only by exposing its falsity could they reclaim their lives. The next days unfolded with a heaviness that pressed on Lana like a weight she could not shake, because although she had managed to gather fragments of truth, those fragments were powerless unless she could weave them into something undeniable. And every hour her brother remained in the custody of Dalton's patrol gnawed at her composure. The HOA, emboldened by its ability to silence ordinary complaints, escalated its pressure in ways that blurred the line between intimidation and open harassment. A letter appeared on her doorstep claiming that her property was now under review for compliance violations. The language vague yet threatening, citing infractions she knew to be fabricated: grass too long despite her freshly cut lawn, architectural modifications made without approval even though every detail of her home had been approved in advance, and, most absurdly, the allegation of harboring unauthorized individuals. To Lana, the meaning was clear. They wanted her to retreat, to surrender. Not only her protests about Mark, but her very right to live in the neighborhood without constant scrutiny. She refused, though fear stirred beneath her defiance. At night she heard footsteps near her porch, not the soft tread of neighbors out for a walk, but deliberate movements that paused beneath her windows before retreating, and once she woke to find a notice taped to her front door, warning that repeated non-compliance could result in fines, liens, and community interventions. She had no doubt now that Dalton was escalating the conflict personally, and when she confronted the receptionist at the HOA office again, the woman simply smiled with the bland expression of someone trained to dismiss every protest with polite indifference, repeating the same phrase: "If you believe there has been an error, you may file a formal complaint." Lana knew those complaints vanished into a drawer, never to be answered. Mark, on his side of confinement, recognized that the theater was beginning to fray. His captors, though eager to project authority, grew restless in his presence, as if they sensed they were holding a man who could not be cowed. Their questions became repetitive, their attempts at intimidation clumsy. One guard, frustrated by Mark's calm refusal to give them the panic they wanted, muttered under his breath that Dalton was losing patience and wanted a stronger display. That phrase, innocuous to the inexperienced, told Mark what he needed. Dalton was not satisfied with detaining him. He wanted a spectacle, something that would reinforce his power in the eyes of the neighborhood, and that meant Mark's detention was not the end, but the prelude to a larger performance. The second escalation came in the form of a community meeting announced suddenly for the following evening, with flyers distributed to every household. The topic, according to the notice, was unregistered threats and the importance of compliance. Lana attended, her chest tight with dread, and sat among rows of neighbors whose expressions flickered between curiosity and unease. Dalton stood at the front of the room, flanked by 2 patrol members in their counterfeit uniforms, and spoke with a gravity designed to command fear. He told the residents that a man had been discovered living within the community without authorization, a man who refused to identify himself, who behaved suspiciously, who posed a potential danger. Though he never named Mark, his description was pointed, calculated to paint him as an intruder rather than the brother of a homeowner. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience, and Lana felt eyes turning toward her, though no one dared speak her name aloud. When Dalton unveiled a grainy photograph projected onto the wall, Mark seated in the so-called interrogation room, his expression unreadable, Lana nearly rose to her feet to shout the truth. But she stopped, recognizing the trap. Dalton wanted her outburst, wanted to label her as complicit, to turn her into a symbol of defiance that must be crushed. Instead, she clenched her fists and remained silent, studying the faces of the neighbors. Some looked convinced, others skeptical, but all were bound by the invisible net of fear, because whether they believed Dalton or not, they knew he controlled their daily lives through fines, approvals, and threats. After the meeting, Lana approached quietly, asking Dalton once again to release her brother. His response was smooth, but edged with menace. "Cooperation leads to resolution, Ms. Rivers. Resistance only prolongs difficulty." He added, almost as an afterthought, that the HOA board had authorized the patrol to extend detainments if circumstances required. Lana realized with horror that Dalton was rewriting the rules in real time, crafting new bylaws to legitimize whatever he had already decided to do. That night, she resolved to act. Using the fragments of information Mark had uncovered and the clues she had pieced together, she began mapping the clubhouse in her own sketches, noting the location of the basement storage where she suspected the files were kept. She knew that if she could expose the documents, the fabricated fines, the detainment records, the patrol's unofficial operations, then Dalton's structure of lies would collapse. Yet she also knew that every step closer to the truth placed her in greater danger, because Dalton had shifted from subtle intimidation to overt threats, and the patrol had already proven it was willing to abduct in broad daylight. Mark, too, sensed the shift. When another guard slipped and referred to an extended holding, Mark understood that Dalton intended to prolong his captivity until he could stage a final demonstration, perhaps expulsion, or even a mock trial before the residents. He remained calm, outwardly compliant, but inside he measured every detail of his environment. The keys dangling carelessly from a hook, the way the guards left doors unlocked when stepping away, the pattern of footsteps above that told him where the meeting hall was located. He knew the time was approaching when silence would no longer suffice, when exposure rather than observation would be the weapon. For both siblings, the escalation was no longer a question of endurance, but of confrontation. The HOA had crossed the threshold from nuisance into tyranny, and Dalton, blinded by his desire for control, had underestimated the depth of their resolve. The stage was set for collision, and neither Lana nor Mark could retreat. For retreat meant surrender, not just of their rights, but of the very idea that this neighborhood was a place where anyone could live freely. The climax of the ordeal arrived not with the quiet inevitability of paperwork or whispered threats, but with the sudden, calculated spectacle Dalton had been engineering, because for men like him, power was never secure unless it was displayed before others, and so he summoned the residents once again under the guise of a mandatory assembly. Lana entered the clubhouse hall with her heart pounding, aware that this would not be another bland lecture about compliance, and as she took her seat among the rows of tense neighbors, she noticed how the atmosphere had shifted. The whispers were sharper, the stares lingered on her with greater suspicion, and the two patrol members flanking the stage carried themselves with theatrical solemnity, as though rehearsing for a ceremony rather than maintaining order. Dalton stood at the podium, his suit immaculate, his smile thin, and when he began to speak, his voice carried the same cadence of bureaucratic certainty that had silenced countless objections before. Yet, tonight, he aimed not at silencing, but at convincing, weaving a narrative in which the neighborhood had been infiltrated by a dangerous outsider, a man who had refused to comply with rules designed to protect them all. Then, with a gesture meant to elicit gasps, Dalton ordered the patrol to bring forth the detainee, and Mark appeared from a side door, his wrists loosely bound, his posture calm but commanding, his eyes scanning the room with the measured composure of someone who had seen true interrogations and understood that this charade was built on nothing but arrogance. The residents shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others leaning forward as though desperate to glimpse the man who had been cast as a villain in Dalton's narrative. Lana felt the urge to shout the truth, to proclaim that this was her brother, a guest in her home, not an intruder, but she restrained herself because Mark's steady gaze met hers for the briefest moment, and in that glance she understood. He had a plan, and her silence was part of it. Dalton launched into his performance, recounting fabricated offenses, presenting selectively altered reports, and warning that if the community tolerated such defiance, it would soon fall into chaos. His words rippled through the hall, but for the first time, cracks appeared in his authority because some neighbors frowned at the inconsistencies, remembering perhaps their own encounters with the patrol, the petty humiliations and the arbitrary fines. Mark chose that moment to act, not with violence but with words, raising his voice with the calm resonance of someone used to command, declaring that he had allowed himself to be taken without resistance so that the truth of this farce could be revealed, and then, with deliberate precision, he described what he had witnessed in detention: the forged documents, the careless signatures, the empty radios, the files kept in the basement that contained fabricated charges against their own. Neighbors. The room stirred with unease. Dalton tried to interrupt, but Mark's voice rose above his, and finally he did what Dalton had never anticipated. He revealed his true identity, stating plainly that he was part of the governor's protective detail and that Dalton's patrol had in fact abducted a member of state security under false authority. The silence that followed was not merely shock but the shattering of illusion, because in that instant every neighbor who had doubted, every resident who had feared, suddenly realized that the Emperor had no clothes, that the authority Dalton had, wielded so ruthlessly, was nothing more than pretense held together by fear and compliance. Dalton stammered, insisting it was a misunderstanding, that Mark had impersonated his role, but the patrolman beside him faltered, their rigid posture unraveling as uncertainty spread. Then came the final blow, the sound of sirens approaching outside, not the unmarked SUV of Dalton's hired guards, but real police vehicles called by an anonymous resident who had grown uneasy after hearing whispers about the meeting. The doors opened, uniformed officers entered, and the sight of authentic authority against Dalton's counterfeit shattered the last threads of his control. As the police demanded explanations, Dalton flailed, producing his fabricated bylaws and insisting on the legitimacy of the patrol. But Mark calmly stepped forward, presenting himself formally and recounting the events with the clarity of an after-action report, providing details that only someone of his training could observe. The officers quickly recognized the seriousness, the impersonation of law enforcement, the unlawful detainment, the evidence of systematic intimidation. Dalton's voice broke into sputters, his confidence collapsing, while neighbors rose from their seats, murmuring not with fear, but with outrage. Lana felt the surge of vindication rise in her chest, not the fiery triumph of victory, but the steadier warmth of relief, because at last the truth had pierced the veil of lies. The days that followed unfolded with an almost surreal quiet, as if the neighborhood itself had exhaled after months of holding its breath, and though the manicured streets and polished lawns remained unchanged, the atmosphere no longer carried the same suffocating tension because the mask had been ripped away, and the illusion of control shattered in full view of those who had once accepted it without question. Dalton was taken into custody along with the men who had paraded as officers, and the clubhouse that had served as their stage for intimidation was sealed off as investigators carried out boxes of files, binders filled with falsified charges, and recordings that captured the voices of frightened residents coerced into compliance. For the first time since moving there, Lana felt the boundaries of the place soften, neighbors approaching her not with suspicion but with hesitant gratitude, admitting that they too had suffered but had lacked the courage to resist until the facade collapsed. Mark remained at her side, no longer the anonymous guest mistaken for an intruder, but revealed for who he truly was. Though he never flaunted his position, instead he spoke little of his work, preferring to let the facts of what had happened speak for themselves. His composure had been the constant thread through the chaos, and now, as he walked the neighborhood with her, Lana noticed how residents greeted him with nods of respect, their eyes carrying the relief of people who realized they had been delivered from a prison they had not even known they inhabited. For Lana, the victory was not merely that her brother was safe or that Dalton's false regime had collapsed, but that she had discovered within herself a resilience she had never been forced to test before, a recognition that the structures designed to confine could be dismantled if confronted with truth and persistence. The HOA itself was suspended pending investigation, its authority stripped away, and rumors spread that the state would intervene to dissolve it entirely. Whether that would happen quickly or drag through the courts no longer mattered to Lana, because the spell had been broken, and once people saw that those who claimed control were only men hiding behind paperwork and borrowed symbols, fear could not be so easily reimposed. On her porch one evening, as the sun sank low and the silence of the neighborhood felt at last like genuine peace rather than enforced order, she turned to Mark and thanked him, not only for his presence but for showing her that standing against tyranny, no matter how small or localized, was possible. He smiled faintly, reminding her that strength was not about grand gestures but about refusing to yield when yielding seemed easiest. And she understood that though the scars of the ordeal would linger, so too would the clarity it had brought.